White woman attempted to take black boy's seat. 17 minutes later, she discovered his dad owns the entire airline. Get out of that seat, Blackie. The words rang out, sharp and cold, cutting through the noise of the bustling airplane. A tense silence followed as every head turned toward the 13-year-old boy, sitting alone by the window. His heart skipped a beat, and his stomach dropped. Was this really happening? He had only just boarded the flight, a trip to visit his grandparents, far away from the everyday challenges he faced at school. But now, on this flight, things were about to take an unexpected turn. The woman standing in the aisle, her blonde hair glowing under the overhead lights, stared down at him with disdain. "I'm sitting there. You need to move," she demanded, her voice dripping with entitlement. The boy's hands clenched, but he said nothing. He couldn't. He was only 13. The airline crew, who should have been his safety net, stood there watching in silence. Some even glanced away, as if it was none of their business. He looked around the cabin, passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes avoiding his. "Excuse me," he stammered, but his voice barely rose above the hum of the engines. The woman's smirk only deepened, her posture more demanding. "What? You can't even speak properly?" she mocked, a laugh escaping her lips. The boy's chest tightened as the bullying intensified. His hands were sweating, his throat dry. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't just a rude comment. This was racial discrimination, pure and simple. And no one was coming to help. The situation was slipping from his control, fast. Tears pricked at his eyes, but he held them back. He knew he couldn't let the situation escalate any further. He had to do something. He had to call his dad. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling. In a matter of seconds, the phone rang, and as the screen flashed his father's name, he pressed the call button. "Dad, please. They're making fun of me. They're treating me like I don't belong," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. But the woman's eyes bored into him, and his heart raced. The calm voice on the other end of the phone didn't bring the reassurance he expected. It was something else. It was power, authority. And the conversation was about to change everything. "Son, stay calm. I'll take care of this. Let me talk to them." But what would happen next? Would his father's words be enough to turn the tide? Would the authorities finally take action? Or would the boy be left to fight this battle alone? Can you relate to what the boy is going through? Have you ever faced a moment where you were treated unfairly based on your skin color? Share your thoughts below. We want to hear your story. When and where did it happen to you? If you believe in fairness and standing up against injustice, like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Hyper Racism channel. Your support helps us fight back against this kind of discrimination, one story at a time. The words his father spoke were calm, steady, filled with the kind of authority that only years of experience could forge. But for the boy, it wasn't enough. His mind raced. How could he explain the hurt and confusion, the isolation, the sting of being treated like he didn't belong? He had been raised to be calm, poised, to rise above any obstacle with intelligence and grace. But nothing could have prepared him for this. The boy, whose name was Jordan, wasn't just any teenager. At 13 years old, he had already been marked by life's difficulties in ways few could imagine. Raised in a city where racial tensions often ran high, Jordan had learned early that he would need to prove himself more than others. His parents had emphasized the importance of education and composure, both qualities Jordan took to heart. He excelled at school, spoke confidently, and held his head high. He wasn't the troublemaker, the angry child. He was the quiet, intelligent one, the one who never raised his voice, never fought back unless necessary. Jordan's father, Victor, was a successful entrepreneur, a man who had built his wealth from the ground up. He was the owner of several companies across various industries, and he had always worked tirelessly to create a better life for his family. Despite his business success, Victor remained humble, always reminding Jordan that it was the values of respect, fairness, and kindness that would matter the most in life. Jordan looked up to his father with immense pride. His father was everything he aspired to be: intelligent, composed, and a man who knew how to command respect. Jordan had never been on a flight alone before. This trip to visit his grandparents in another state was a milestone, one that was supposed to be filled with excitement. But now, as the seconds ticked by, all of that excitement felt distant. The flight was luxurious, with plush leather seats, spacious legroom, and all the trappings of an elite, first-class experience. Yet, in that moment, the splendor of the surroundings seemed to fade into the background. Jordan felt like an outsider. The whispers of the other passengers, the cold stares, the unspoken tension, he could sense it all. They looked at him as if he didn't belong. They looked at him like he was nothing more than a nuisance. The plane had taken off from a busy airport in New York, a bustling metropolis where wealth and privilege blended seamlessly with poverty and struggle. Jordan's family, although affluent, had always worked hard to keep their feet firmly planted on the ground. They didn't flaunt their wealth or power. But on this flight, as Jordan sat alone, those qualities seemed to matter less. The woman who had demanded his seat, her name was Margaret, embodied everything Jordan's family had fought against in their rise to success. Margaret was in her mid-40s, with a perfectly manicured appearance and the kind of aura that screamed entitlement. She was the type of person who had been accustomed to getting what she wanted, no questions asked. Margaret was seated a few rows ahead of Jordan, her blonde hair cascading down her shoulders like a halo of privilege. She carried herself with an air of superiority, her nose slightly tilted upward, as though she was always looking down on everyone around her. When she had first boarded the plane, Jordan had noticed her immediately. He had observed the way she smiled at the flight attendants, the way she demanded an extra pillow, the way she spoke to the people around her like they were beneath her. Jordan didn't care about the superficial aspects of Margaret's character, her appearance, her manners, none of that mattered to him. He only cared about one thing: how she made him feel. She had taken one look at him and immediately dismissed him, assuming he didn't belong in the seat he had carefully chosen. Her words were cutting, her tone condescending, and as she continued to stand there, demanding that he vacate the seat, Jordan's calm demeanor faltered. In that moment, Jordan's mind was flooded with thoughts. How could this be happening? Why did this woman think she had the right to treat him like this? Was he just another black boy to her, a nameless face she could push aside? He wanted to defend himself, to argue back, but the words stuck in his throat. He was just a kid. He was alone. There were no adults here to help him. Jordan had been taught never to fight back unless it was necessary. But the more Margaret mocked him, the more he realized that silence would no longer protect him. He had to speak up. But as he prepared to voice his frustration, he hesitated. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about something deeper. It was about his worth as a person, as a human being. And when he looked around, no one else seemed to care. No one else was stepping in to help him. The flight attendants? They weren't intervening. The passengers? They were either too afraid or too indifferent to speak up. His finger hovered over the phone, and he quickly dialed his father's number. As the phone rang, he wished, more than anything, that he didn't have to go through this alone. But his father's voice was his only anchor now. "Dad, please, they won't let me stay in my seat. They're making fun of me." Jordan's voice trembled, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Victor's response was immediate and firm. "Stay calm, son. Let me take care of this." As the phone call ended, Jordan couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would his father's influence be enough to reverse the situation? Would anyone take him seriously now that his father had stepped in? Or would he be left in the same place, feeling small and insignificant? The woman's mocking laughter echoed in Jordan's ears, but something inside him stirred. He wasn't alone anymore. His father, the man who had built an empire, was on the other end of the phone, ready to fight for him. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about standing up for what was right, about showing the world that power and privilege didn't get to define who he was. What would happen next? Would the tables turn in Jordan's favor? Would Margaret face the consequences of her actions, or would she continue to wield her power with impunity? And more importantly, would Jordan ever be able to escape the sting of the words she had thrown at him? Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to push you aside because of who you are? How did you handle it? Share your experience with us. We want to hear your thoughts. Jordan sat there, feeling the heat rise in his chest. The laughter of Margaret, the woman who had claimed the seat beside him, still lingered in his ears like an echo he couldn't shake off. She had no idea who she was dealing with. He was just a boy, a 13-year-old who was trying to navigate the complicated world of travel and family visits. But she saw only his skin, his color, and for that, she assumed she had the right to belittle him, to treat him like an outsider. The nerve of it, the absolute nerve. His fingers tightened around the armrest of the seat, the muscles in his jaw stiffening as he fought to keep himself composed. His father's words echoed in his head, "Stay calm, son. Let me handle this." But it wasn't enough. The humiliation, the sting of her words, it all felt like it was building up, waiting to spill over. Jordan wanted to say something, anything, but the words seemed to slip away as Margaret leaned over him, her face still twisted in that smug expression. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Are you going to move, or do I need to call the flight attendants to get you thrown off this plane?" Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to stand up for himself. But he knew, deep down, that if he reacted, if he let her provoke him, it would only make things worse. He'd been taught his whole life to rise above the petty insults, to never let someone else's hatred define his worth. But in this moment, sitting on this plane, surrounded by strangers who wouldn't even look at him, he was starting to wonder if his composure was all for nothing. Margaret, sensing his hesitation, only pushed harder. She took a step forward, standing tall above him. "I don't care who you think you are, boy," she spat, her eyes narrowing. "This is my seat and you need to get out." The words cut like a knife, sharper than any insult he had heard in his young life. But he had never been called that before, not in that tone. Not with that much venom. It was as though he wasn't even a human being in her eyes, but something less, something disposable. Jordan's hands began to shake. He gripped the armrest harder, trying to steady himself. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about dignity. It was about standing up for who he was, for the person his father had taught him to be. He had always been calm, composed, the picture of a young man who had everything together. But in that moment he felt small. Small, alone, and helpless in a world that had turned its back on him. Margaret's voice rang out again, this time louder, more demanding. "I said move." She leaned down, her face inches from his, her breath hot and heavy with disdain. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. No one came to his defense. Jordan swallowed hard, trying to push back the lump in his throat. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, loud and thumping like a drum. His father's words still echoed in his mind, but they were beginning to fade, drowned out by the overwhelming pressure of the moment. What could he do? How could he fight this kind of hatred, this kind of prejudice? Just as he was about to stand up, to give in to her demand, a sudden thought struck him. His father's phone call. His father, Victor, wasn't just any man. He wasn't just a businessman. He was powerful, respected. And just like that, Jordan's resolve solidified. He wasn't going to let this woman win. He wasn't going to let her degrade him in front of everyone. Not this time. Jordan's fingers moved quickly to his phone again. His father had told him to stay calm, but it was time for him to step in. He dialed the number, his thumb pressing the screen with urgency. The phone rang 3 times before his father's calm voice filled his ear. "Dad, she won't stop. She's making me feel like I don't belong here. She's treating me like I'm invisible." Jordan's voice cracked as he spoke, but he held his ground. "Please help me." Victor's response was immediate, cutting through the tension like a hot knife. "I'm on it, son. You don't have to deal with this. Stay put." The phone clicked off, and in that moment, Jordan felt a shift that could only be described as the beginning of something much bigger. His father's influence wasn't just about money or business deals. It was about justice. It was about fairness. And it was about making sure that people like Margaret, people who thought they could wield their privilege over others, knew their place. Jordan's hands stopped shaking, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as he watched Margaret with renewed confidence. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. He wasn't going to let her get away with making him feel like he was less than human. But Margaret wasn't done yet. She took another step closer, her eyes narrowing, her voice cold as ice. You think your father can save you? You think he has enough power to make me move? This is my flight, my seat, and you will move, or I will have you removed. You don't belong here. Jordan stared at her, his jaw set in a firm line. But just as he was about to respond, something changed. A shadow passed over the aisle, and the flight attendants, who had been silent observers up until now, finally stepped in. But it wasn't just any flight attendant. This was a man with a presence, a man who had the authority to put an end to this. He turned to Margaret, his voice firm but respectful. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to return to your seat. This situation is under control." Margaret's face flushed red with fury, but for the first time, she hesitated. The power dynamics had shifted, and Jordan could feel the tide beginning to turn. What would happen next? Would Margaret accept the intervention, or would she continue to push her agenda? And more importantly, would Jordan's father's influence be enough to completely change the course of this flight? The tension was palpable. Everyone around them seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation to unfold. Would the tables turn? Or was Jordan about to face an even more intense battle than before? What would you have done in Jordan's shoes? Would you have stayed calm, or would you have fought back harder? Share your thoughts below. The tension in the cabin was thick, almost suffocating. The moment the flight attendants intervened, Margaret's confidence wavered, but her stubbornness was still there, evident in her rigid stance and the way her lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. Jordan could feel the atmosphere shift, but he wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not after everything he'd been through. He could see her, Margaret, standing tall, glaring at the flight attendant who had stepped in. She seemed to think she could bulldoze her way through the situation. The power struggle was still ongoing, and Jordan was now caught in the middle of it, feeling more and more like a pawn in someone else's game. But the flight attendants had done their part. They had made it clear that this was going to end here, that they weren't going to let Margaret push Jordan around any longer. "Ma'am, you will return to your seat," the flight attendant insisted again, but this time his tone was firmer, more resolute. There was no sign of hesitation or reluctance now. He was standing his ground, and for the first time since this drama began, Jordan felt like maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning in his favor. Margaret opened her mouth, ready to argue, but before she could speak, there was a shift in the air, something unmistakable. Jordan felt it too. His fingers tightened around his phone, the grip now almost instinctive as he waited. And then his phone buzzed again, a message from his father lighting up the screen. "Tell them who you are," the text read. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he froze. His father had never told him to pull rank before. He had never instructed him to use his name or status as a weapon. Victor always wanted Jordan to prove himself through his actions, not through what he could claim. But now, in this moment, Jordan had been pushed to the edge. He had no choice but to reveal the truth. Jordan swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of power and hesitation flood his chest. His voice, steady and calm, cut through the tension. "Actually," he began, his words surprisingly clear and strong, "my father is the owner of this airline." Margaret's eyes flickered toward him, the smirk on her face slowly faltering as the words sank in. The flight attendants froze, and for a split second, the world seemed to pause. Jordan had said it without any fanfare, just a simple truth hanging in the air like a challenge. His voice rang in the cabin, a soft but undeniable declaration that shifted the balance of power. There was an uncomfortable silence before the full weight of his words seemed to hit everyone in the room. Jordan could see the change in Margaret's expression, a subtle flicker of doubt, then a heavy wave of realization washing over her. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had just been confronted with the harsh truth she never expected. The boy she had mocked, the boy she had tried to push around, was far from powerless. He wasn't some random passenger. He was the son of the person who owned the very airline they were flying on. The flight attendants exchanged a glance, their professional composure cracking slightly. The look they shared was unmistakable. They were caught in a moral bind. Up until this point, they had followed the rules, tried to keep things as civil as possible. But now, the situation had escalated beyond their control. Margaret, her face drained of color, took a step back. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the overhead compartment, her earlier bravado completely shattered. Her eyes flicked from Jordan to the flight attendants, then back to Jordan again. She clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. It was like a mask had fallen from her face, and in its place was an unmistakable expression of regret and fear. "What did you say?" she stammered, her voice suddenly weak, less sure of itself. "My father owns this airline," Jordan repeated, his voice unwavering despite the sudden change in the atmosphere. "Victor Westbrook. And he doesn't take kindly to people who treat others like this." The words felt strange on his tongue, but as he spoke them, he felt a surge of something else. Relief, perhaps. Power. This was the moment that shifted everything. It wasn't just about his father's name. It was about the truth of what his father represented. Justice, fairness, and the ability to right wrongs when they happened. Margaret's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Jordan thought she might apologize. But instead, she just stood there, her jaw clenched, her fingers still gripping the armrests of her seat, as though trying to find some ground to stand on. The woman who had once looked down on him now seemed like she was crumbling in front of him, her arrogance replaced by a new, chilling uncertainty. The flight attendants quickly moved into action. One of them, a woman with short-cropped black hair and an air of authority, stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to take your seat and remain there for the rest of the flight. We will be contacting our head office when we land." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but she stopped herself. She looked from the flight attendant to Jordan, the weight of the situation now fully sinking in. She had pushed too far, and now it was clear there would be consequences. But before she could speak, the flight attendant turned to Jordan, offering him a polite but sympathetic smile. "You've done the right thing, sir. Please stay seated, and we will ensure you're taken care of." Jordan nodded, though he was still processing everything. His father had always taught him to act with integrity, to stand tall and not let anyone take advantage of him. He had done that, but this was different. He had just revealed something that no one on this flight had expected, and now the power had shifted. Margaret's face twisted with frustration, but she remained seated in silence for the rest of the flight. The cabin was still, the hum of the engines the only sound. The passengers, who had been silent observers up until now, exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak up. The tension in the air was palpable, but it was no longer aimed at Jordan. It was directed at Margaret, who had once thought she could control the situation with her privilege. Now, the power dynamics had shifted completely. But Jordan knew this wasn't over. The flight was long, and they still had hours before they landed. What would happen when they touched down? Would Margaret try to save face? Would she attempt to use her connections to undo everything Jordan had just exposed? Or had her arrogance finally met its match in a 13-year-old boy who knew how to stand his ground? Have you ever been in a situation where the truth changed everything? Where power dynamics shifted because of one simple revelation? Share your thoughts below. Do you think Jordan did the right thing? What would you have done in his shoes? Jordan sat there, his back straight, hands resting on his lap, doing his best to hold it together. The calm that had settled in him after his father's words was slowly being replaced by a feeling he hadn't expected, anticipation. The storm wasn't over yet. Margaret wasn't done. Margaret's face had gone white, her earlier defiance faltering as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. She had tried to push him out of his seat, to humiliate him, to make him feel small and insignificant. But instead, she had just been handed a truth so powerful, so undeniable, that it had shaken her to her core. Her face twisted in frustration, the mask of entitlement cracking as the reality of her situation set in. She no longer held the upper hand. The control she thought she had over the situation was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Jordan could feel her eyes burning into him, her gaze a mixture of anger and confusion. Her lips moved as if to say something, but no words came out. The entire cabin was silent, but the eyes of the passengers were on her now, eyes that had once been indifferent, now filled with judgment. "Don't think you can just..." Margaret finally managed to choke out, her voice rising in pitch, but before she could finish, the flight attendant stepped forward again, blocking her path. "Ma'am, I've asked you to return to your seat," the flight attendant said firmly, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something else behind her words. It was a quiet sense of authority, the kind that comes from knowing right from wrong. But Margaret wasn't having it. Her face reddened as her anger boiled over, her pride taking the front seat once more. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she spat, her hands trembling with rage. "I will have both of you fired. You have no idea who I am." The threat was empty. Jordan could hear it in her voice. She was scrambling. This wasn't about the seat anymore. It wasn't about who owned the airline. It was about power, control, and the realization that she had lost both. But Margaret was too far gone. She leaned in closer to Jordan, her breath hot on his face, and for a moment, it seemed as if she was going to lash out. Jordan's heart raced, but he remained still calm. He had made it this far. He wasn't going to let her provoke him now. Margaret's voice, though, grew louder and more shrill, carrying across the cabin. "You think you're so special because of your father? Do you think that gives you the right to sit here like a king while people like me have to deal with this disrespect?" Her words dripped with venom, but the more she spoke, the more she exposed herself. The more she revealed the depth of her own insecurity and entitlement. A few passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some were now looking at her, eyes narrowed, others trying to avoid confrontation. There was a collective sense of discomfort, but no one had yet stepped in to speak up. It wasn't until one man, sitting a few rows ahead, stood up that the situation took another turn. "I don't know what's going on here, but no one should be treated this way," the man called out, his voice firm. "This kid doesn't deserve to be treated like that. It's not right." There was a brief moment of stunned silence before another passenger, a woman in her 40s, wearing a business suit, added, "We're all here to get to our destination in peace. Everyone deserves respect. If you can't respect others, you need to sit down and stay quiet." The entire cabin seemed to collectively inhale. The stakes had just been raised. The confrontation had gone from a private clash between Jordan and Margaret to a public spectacle. People were taking sides, slowly but surely. The flight attendants, who had remained neutral up until now, exchanged glances as they realized they were no longer the only authority in the room. Margaret's face contorted in disbelief. She wasn't used to being challenged, to having her actions called out. She was used to people bending to her will, to her power. But now, in front of a dozen passengers who were beginning to side with Jordan, the power dynamics had shifted. "You," Margaret started, but she was cut off by the sound of a voice from the back of the plane. "Hey, lady, you're making a fool of yourself. Just sit down and shut up," a man yelled, his words loud and clear. The others nodded in agreement, some murmuring their disapproval, others shaking their heads. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone on this plane who had been subjected to Margaret's entitlement, her bullying, her toxic need for control. The flight attendants, now emboldened by the growing support from the passengers, stepped forward with more authority. The woman who had spoken to Margaret earlier looked her square in the eye and said, "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time. Please take your seat and remain there. We are not going to tolerate this behavior on this flight." Margaret's fists clenched at her sides, and for a brief moment, it looked like she might try to charge at Jordan. She was that angry. Her face was twisted with rage, her eyes wide and frantic. But something held her back. Maybe it was the realization that she was no longer in control. Maybe it was the fact that she had been exposed for who she truly was. Jordan remained still, his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm. But inside, his mind was racing. He had seen this before, the way people like Margaret could try to push others around. The way they could bully their way through situations, using their privilege and status to make others feel small. But now, Jordan wasn't small. He wasn't powerless. And he wasn't going to let her win. Margaret's breathing was heavy, her nostrils flaring as she stood there, deciding her next move. Her arrogance had cracked, and now she was at a crossroads. Would she back down or would she lash out? She opened her mouth to speak again, but the words caught in her throat. The silence that followed was deafening, like a storm about to break. Every passenger was waiting, breath held, waiting to see what would happen next. Would Margaret explode, or would she finally yield? The air was thick with tension. Everyone knew this wasn't just about a seat on a plane anymore. This was about the battle for respect, for fairness, for dignity. And at that moment, the stakes had never been higher. The tension in the cabin was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Margaret's anger had been building ever since Jordan had revealed his father's identity. Her body shook with frustration, but the realization that she was no longer in control was beginning to sink in. She stood there, trembling, caught between her pride and the mounting pressure of the passengers who were now openly watching, waiting for her next move. Jordan remained seated, his posture composed, his hands steady. Every muscle in his body was taut with the knowledge that this moment would define everything. He had done everything he could to remain calm, to handle the situation with dignity, but this was the final act. This was the moment where everything would come to a head. Margaret's face was a deep shade of crimson, her fists clenched so tight that her knuckles were white. She was cornered, with no way out. The passengers had sided with Jordan. The flight attendants were standing firm. She had nowhere left to run. The only thing she could do was lash out. "You're nothing but a spoiled brat." Margaret screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "Your father doesn't own this airline. This is ridiculous. I demand to speak to someone higher than you." Her words were frantic now, as though she was trying to hold on to the remnants of her dignity. But they fell on deaf ears. The flight attendants, now emboldened by the collective support from the passengers, weren't backing down. "Ma'am, you've been asked to remain seated. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we will be forced to take further action," the flight attendant replied, her voice unwavering as she motioned for her colleague to step closer. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Margaret's face twisted in disbelief, her eyes darting around the cabin, searching for an ally, a way out. But there was no one left. Not anymore. Jordan's eyes didn't leave Margaret's face. He watched her with an intensity that surprised even him. He had faced bullies before, at school, at the park, even at family gatherings. But this was something different. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. This was about standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Margaret, now visibly sweating, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You don't know who I am," she shouted, her voice hoarse with anger. "I'll have all of you fired. Do you think your little stunt is going to work?" Her eyes flared with contempt. "I'll call my lawyer and you'll all regret this." But her threats didn't land. There was no fear in the air, no nervous shifting of eyes. Instead, there was a palpable sense of justice that was rising. The passengers, once silent, now began to murmur in agreement, their voices growing louder. "You can't treat people like that," a man in a suit called out from a few rows behind Margaret. "I've had enough of this." His voice was firm, filled with conviction. "Respect everyone, or get off the plane." Another voice chimed in, followed by a chorus of murmurs and nods from others. Margaret's eyes darted around the cabin, seeing the faces of people who had, up until this point, been indifferent to her entitled behavior. But now they weren't looking away. They weren't ignoring her. They were watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. Jordan had done nothing more than stand up for himself, yet he had become the catalyst for something much larger. He had done what no one else had dared to do. He had exposed the truth. And now, in the face of growing support from strangers, the bully was losing her grip. But Margaret wasn't done. She was unraveling, her desperation rising with every passing second. She turned to the flight attendants, her voice high-pitched, practically shrieking. "I demand to speak to the captain. I will not let this go. This is outrageous." The flight attendants exchanged glances, and it was clear, this was no longer just about handling a passenger issue. This had become something bigger. The situation had escalated beyond what could be resolved by simple customer service. One of the attendants, a tall man with a calm demeanor, stepped forward. He spoke clearly and loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Ma'am, you've been informed of the consequences. We are now proceeding to inform the captain and senior flight crew. If you continue to escalate this, we will need to involve airport security upon landing." Margaret's face paled as the full weight of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a matter of a seat on an airplane anymore. This was a matter of her reputation, her dignity, and the reality that she was no longer the powerful, untouchable woman she had been just a few moments ago. The other passengers had made it clear they were no longer afraid of her. She was no longer the authority. She was the outcast. And Jordan? He was now the one with the power. The shift was complete. But just as Margaret opened her mouth to speak again, the captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you all remain in your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We will be landing shortly. For your safety, please stay calm and respect the crew's instructions. We will address this situation on the ground." It was the final blow. The captain's words, paired with the public exposure of Margaret's behavior, sent a clear message. This was over. She had lost. And she knew it. As the plane began its descent, Jordan sat quietly in his seat, his thoughts racing. He had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, and now, as the airplane touched down and the seatbelt signs flashed, the reality of what had just transpired started to sink in. He had done the right thing. He had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had shown that even in the face of hate, there was power in remaining composed, in refusing to let the words of others define you. But as the plane taxied to a stop at the gate, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Margaret's humiliation wasn't just about her personal defeat. It was about something much larger. What would happen when they got off the plane? Would she try to spin the story to save face? Would her connections try to undo everything that had just unfolded? The flight attendants began their final rounds, preparing to deboard passengers. The air was thick with anticipation. Jordan's eyes met Margaret's for one last time. Her gaze was empty now, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The proud woman who had once tried to belittle him was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self. But Jordan knew this wasn't over. Not yet. And as the flight attendants made their way down the aisles, the first few passengers began to get up, one by one. It wasn't just about the end of this flight. It was about the way this would change the way people saw themselves and each other, in a world where injustice could no longer be swept under the rug. What would happen next? Would Margaret try to reclaim her dignity, or would she simply fade into the background, forever marked by her actions? Would she try to get revenge, or would she finally learn the lesson that no one, no matter their status, was above respect? The showdown wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What would you do if you were Jordan? Would you stand your ground in the face of such hostility, or would you have reacted differently? Share your thoughts below. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, their steps measured, as though they were preparing for something. The shift in atmosphere was palpable. The passengers, who had been quiet spectators up until now, seemed to take a collective breath. The whole cabin had been transformed from a quiet space of discomfort to a battlefield of justice. And as the airplane slowed to a stop on the tarmac, Jordan felt a quiet sense of triumph rise in his chest. Margaret, however, was not so composed. Her face was flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation, her eyes darting nervously as she looked around, as if searching for an escape. But there was no escape. Not now. Not after everything that had just unfolded. The flight attendants approached her, their demeanor no longer polite but firm, authoritative. "Ma'am, we've informed the captain about your behavior," the flight attendant who had spoken earlier said, her tone unyielding. "We're going to have to ask you to step off the plane last. You'll be escorted by airport security to ensure there are no further issues." The words hit Margaret like a slap in the face. She opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Her eyes widened in disbelief, the sting of public humiliation settling deep into her bones. She was the one who had tried to push Jordan around, who had treated him like he was invisible. And now, she was being treated like a criminal. The power she had once wielded, power built on her privilege and entitlement, was gone. And the realization that she had been exposed, that the entire plane had seen her for who she really was, seemed to break her. But Jordan? He sat there, calm, unshaken. He had done what was right, not out of vengeance, but because it was the only thing he could do. His father's teachings had always centered on integrity, on doing what was right even when no one else was watching. But today, Jordan had been watching. And the consequences of his actions, standing up for himself, standing up for respect, were already unfolding. As Margaret was escorted off the plane, she shot Jordan one final, desperate glare, but there was no anger left in it. Only fear. Fear of the power she had underestimated, the power of truth. Jordan didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. His victory had already been sealed. Margaret's disgrace was now etched into the history of that flight, and there was nothing she could do to erase it. The flight attendants turned to Jordan, their faces filled with genuine admiration. "You did the right thing," one of them said quietly. "Thank you for staying calm. You showed real courage in a tough situation." Jordan smiled slightly, the weight of the situation slowly lifting from his shoulders. He nodded, but there were no words left to say. He had already said everything that needed to be said. He had stood up for himself, and he had stood up for everyone who had ever been made to feel small by people like Margaret. As the passengers began to deboard, many of them gave Jordan looks of quiet approval, some offering him supportive words. "Good job, kid," one man said, clapping him on the shoulder as he passed. A woman behind him nodded and smiled. "It's good to see someone stand up for what's right," she said softly. The passengers, who had once been divided into quiet, nervous groups, now seemed united in their approval of Jordan. It was as though the shared experience of witnessing the truth unfold had created a bond between them all. They had seen what it meant to face injustice head-on and to come out on the other side stronger. As Jordan stepped off the plane, the weight of everything that had happened still hung heavily on his mind. But there was a sense of peace within him, too. He had done the right thing. He had fought for his dignity. And in doing so, he had helped shift the power dynamic in a way that no one had expected. But just as he was about to head toward the terminal, a voice called out to him from behind. "Jordan, wait up." It was one of the flight attendants, the same one who had stepped in when the confrontation began. She caught up to him, her expression now softer, more personal. "I just wanted to say you were amazing back there," she said, her voice filled with genuine respect. "You stood your ground when most people would have folded. Not a lot of people have the strength to do that. It's not easy, but you did it. You taught all of us a lesson today." Jordan smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. It wasn't the applause that mattered. It wasn't the recognition. It was the feeling that, in that moment, justice had been served. It was the feeling of standing up and being seen for who he was, not what others tried to make him. "You're welcome," he said simply. His voice was steady, but beneath the calm exterior, a sense of pride swelled within him. His father's words echoed in his mind. Justice isn't just about being right. It's about standing for what's fair, no matter the cost. The attendant gave him a small nod before walking away, her head held high, as if carrying a piece of the victory with her. Jordan turned back toward the terminal, his steps light despite the heavy emotions swirling inside him. As he passed through the airport, he couldn't help but feel the eyes of those around him. Some of them were curious, others were admiring, but none of them were judging him. They had seen the truth unfold in front of them, and now, they were witnessing the aftermath. But even as Jordan felt a sense of fulfillment, he knew that Margaret wasn't going to let this go so easily. There would be consequences for her. And there was no telling how far she would go to try to regain control, to restore her shattered sense of power. What would happen to her when this news got out? Would she try to use her influence to silence the story, or would the public shame be enough to put an end to her bullying ways? And more importantly, what would happen to Jordan? Would this moment be the start of something larger, something that would change the way people viewed justice, respect, and power in society? As Jordan stepped into the busy terminal, a thought lingered in his mind. This battle was over, but the war for equality, for fairness, for dignity, that was just beginning. As Jordan walked through the terminal, the noise of the airport washed over him, but it felt distant, muted. The hustle and bustle of travelers, the loudspeakers announcing departures, the hurried footsteps of people rushing to their gates, it all seemed to fade away. His mind was still back on the plane, replaying the confrontation, the moments of tension, and the relief that followed. The way Margaret had tried to tear him down, only to be undone by the truth. The crowd around him seemed to move in a blur as Jordan's thoughts circled back to one thing: justice. It was a word that had been tossed around casually in his life, but today he had seen it unfold in real time. He had stood up for what was right, despite the fear and uncertainty he'd felt. And in doing so, he had reclaimed a piece of his dignity. Jordan's father, Victor, had always told him that the fight for justice was not about victory for oneself. It was about fighting for others, for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But until that moment on the plane, Jordan hadn't fully understood the weight of those words. He had seen his father fight for equality in the business world, seen him push for fairness in a way that commanded respect. But now, Jordan realized, justice wasn't just a word. It was a choice. A choice to stand tall, to face the fire head-on, and to show the world that no one, no matter their status or skin color, should be allowed to belittle others. He paused, looking out of the large windows that overlooked the tarmac. The world outside seemed vast, full of possibility. But inside him, there was a new awareness, a new understanding of his role in this world. This wasn't just about the fight on the plane. This was about a larger battle. A battle that wouldn't end with one victory or one defeat. It was a battle for racial equality, for respect, for dignity, for fairness. Jordan thought about Margaret. She had been the antagonist in this story, the one who had tried to diminish him, to dehumanize him because of his skin color. But what had she really lost? She had lost her pride, her privilege. She had lost the mask she'd worn for so long, the one that made her feel superior to others. And in the end, she had been exposed for the world to see. But it wasn't just her loss that mattered. It was what had been gained in the process. The passengers who had stood by him, the flight attendants who had supported him, all of them had made a difference. They had chosen to stand up, not just for Jordan, but for what was right. And it had made all the difference. Jordan knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of the story. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to face. But today, he had learned a valuable lesson. One that would stay with him forever. The fight for justice, for equality, for fairness, is not always easy, but it is always worth it. Even when it seems like the world is stacked against you, even when it feels like no one is listening, you have the power to make a difference. You just have to stand up and speak out. As he continued to walk through the terminal, Jordan felt the weight of the day settle into his bones, but there was also something else. A quiet sense of pride. He had been pushed to the edge. He had been humiliated. But in the end, he had won. And the victory wasn't just his. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. He couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if everyone stood up? What if we all chose to make a stand against injustice, to fight for what's right, even when it feels impossible? The thought lingered with him as he stepped into the bustling crowd, moving toward the exit. The airport doors opened, and Jordan stepped out into the sunlight, feeling the weight of the world lift just a little. But there was more work to be done. More stories to be told. More people to stand up for. As he took a deep breath, Jordan knew one thing for certain. The battle for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand up for what's right, even when it was hard? What did you do, and how did it make you feel? Share your story with us. The days following the flight were anything but ordinary. For Jordan, the world seemed to have shifted. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He'd stood up for himself, something he'd never imagined he would have to do on such a public scale. And in doing so, he had ignited a spark of change. The flight had ended, but the ripple effects of the confrontation were just beginning to unfold. The media caught wind of the incident. It wasn't long before the story of the entitled passenger and the 13-year-old boy, who had stood up to her, made its way across news outlets and social media platforms. Headlines spread like wildfire. Teen boy defends himself against racial discrimination mid-flight. And passenger calls out racism on airline, exposes unjust privilege. The outrage was palpable. Social media was flooded with support for Jordan, with people across the country praising him for his courage and composure in the face of adversity. But, as expected, Margaret wasn't ready to admit her wrongdoing. Her public humiliation, however, was just beginning. In the hours after the flight landed, the airline issued an official statement. The company had launched a formal investigation into the incident, and Margaret's actions on the flight were under scrutiny. It wasn't just her confrontation with Jordan that was being questioned, but the way she had attempted to bully her way through the situation, backed by her entitlement. She had made multiple threats, demanded special treatment, and insulted Jordan based on nothing more than his skin color. The news was quick to pick up on the investigation, and as more details emerged, it became clear that Margaret's actions had crossed a line. The airline, in an effort to maintain its image, did not take lightly to the incident. They confirmed that the company had a zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination, racism, and bullying. The press release was direct and firm. The behavior exhibited by this passenger is unacceptable and does not reflect the values of our airline. We are taking immediate action to address this. Jordan's victory was not just in his calm response, but in the power of truth. It was the truth of his identity, his connection to the airline, that had turned the tide. But it was also the truth about the kind of world they lived in, one where unchecked privilege could harm those who had no power to defend themselves. Jordan had spoken up. And in doing so, he had not only exposed Margaret's prejudice but had sparked a larger conversation about racial inequality, about fairness, and about the dignity that every person deserved. Margaret, however, could not escape the consequences of her actions. The airline, following its internal investigation, made a decision that was both swift and severe. Margaret was fired. The company's official statement was clear. As of today, we are terminating the employment of one of our senior flight attendants, who failed to act in accordance with company policies and displayed behavior that is inconsistent with the standards we uphold. But the consequences didn't stop there. The story made waves in the public sphere. Calls flooded into the airline's customer service line, with people both supporting Jordan and demanding justice for his mistreatment. Margaret's reputation, which she had so carefully curated, began to unravel. The media turned its spotlight on her, uncovering a history of questionable behavior and biases that had been hidden beneath the surface. Her social media accounts were bombarded with criticism, with many pointing out how her arrogance and racial prejudice had now been exposed for the world to see. Soon, Margaret became a symbol, not just of privilege and entitlement, but of the dangers of unchecked power. The social backlash was swift, and the professional fallout was catastrophic. She found herself ostracized, blacklisted from further employment within the airline industry. Her name became synonymous with racism and unprofessionalism. The social consequences were swift and unforgiving. She had gone from a woman who once thought she could control situations with her money and status to someone whose actions would follow her for the rest of her life. For Jordan, the aftermath was a mix of emotions. On one hand, there was a sense of vindication. He had stood up for himself, and justice had been served. Margaret's actions were no longer a mere anecdote. They were proof of a larger issue, a pervasive injustice that had to be addressed. But Jordan also knew that this wasn't a single battle. This wasn't a victory that could be celebrated and then forgotten. The truth was, the world was still a place where discrimination existed, where people could be pushed aside, belittled, and made to feel like they didn't belong. And for those who had the privilege to stand up, it was their responsibility to do so. Jordan's schoolmates, teachers, and even his neighbors were all talking about the story. Some praised his courage, others were moved by the way he handled the situation. But Jordan knew that for every person who praised him, countless others might still be facing the same struggles he had endured on that plane. The injustice wasn't gone just because Margaret had faced the consequences of her actions. The battle for racial equality, for respect, was far from over. As the media frenzy died down, Jordan found himself reflecting on how this experience had changed him. He wasn't the same 13-year-old boy who had boarded that flight. He had been forced into a situation where he had to make a choice: remain silent and endure the mistreatment, or speak up and face the consequences. He had chosen the latter, and it had made all the difference. His father, Victor, had been proud of him, but he also reminded him of something important. This is just the beginning, son. Justice doesn't happen overnight. But every time we stand up, we make the world a little bit better. And Jordan realized that his father was right. Standing up for justice wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about staying true to what was right, no matter how difficult it became. The consequences of his actions were far-reaching, not just for Margaret, but for everyone who witnessed the truth come to light. The power dynamics had shifted, not just on the plane, but in the broader context of society. People had seen what happens when you speak the truth, when you refuse to back down in the face of adversity. They had witnessed the impact one voice could have in the fight for racial equality. But as the dust settled, Jordan knew the work was just beginning. There were still so many battles to fight, so many wrongs to right. The consequences Margaret faced were just one example of how injustice could be exposed and corrected. But for Jordan, the most important lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about creating a world where these moments didn't have to happen in the first place. What would happen to people like Margaret in the future? Would they learn from their actions, or would they continue to misuse their power, believing they were untouchable? Could this event spark a change, a shift in how people viewed race and privilege in society? As Jordan stepped out into the warm sunlight, his mind buzzed with everything that had just unfolded. The flight, the confrontation, Margaret's disgrace, everything was still so fresh in his mind, like the taste of victory mixed with the bitter aftertaste of injustice. But as he walked through the terminal, Jordan couldn't help but reflect on something deeper than the immediate aftermath. He wasn't just thinking about his own personal triumph. He was thinking about how his small act of standing up for himself had rippled out, creating change, not just in his life, but in the lives of others as well. The world, Jordan knew, was full of people who believed they could push others down, people like Margaret who saw their skin color as a weapon to wield against those who were different. But Jordan had learned something valuable through all this. He had learned that no one is untouchable. Not when the truth is on your side. Not when you stand tall and refuse to be silenced. The past few days had been a whirlwind, but now, as he walked through the crowd, Jordan felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had shown courage, he had stood for what was right, and in doing so, he had helped make the world a better place, even if it was just a small step in the right direction. But his journey wasn't over. No, not by a long shot. Jordan understood that the fight for justice was ongoing. He wasn't going to stop here. He wasn't going to let the world go back to what it was before. The change that had started on that plane was just the beginning. Jordan had always known that standing up for yourself, standing up for what's right, was important. But he had never realized the power that came from speaking the truth, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against him. When Margaret tried to tear him down, he didn't just defend himself. He took the first step in a larger conversation about racial equality and fairness. And in doing so, he had become a part of something much bigger than himself. The incident on that plane had been a microcosm of the larger issues at play in society, issues of racism, discrimination, and the abuse of power. But Jordan had learned that the only way to fight these issues was through truth, through standing tall, through refusing to let injustice slide. And while he knew that the world wouldn't change overnight, he also knew that his actions had sparked something. He had made a difference. It wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about the people who had watched the story unfold, who had seen what happened when one person decided to stand up and refuse to be silenced. It was about the conversations happening behind closed doors, the lessons being learned in schools, in workplaces, in homes across the country. Margaret's consequences were a direct result of her actions, but the ripple effect of Jordan's bravery would be felt for a long time to come. As he made his way out of the terminal and into the warm embrace of the world outside, Jordan felt ready for whatever came next. He wasn't the same kid who had boarded that plane. He was stronger, wiser, and more aware of the power he held inside himself. And he knew this wouldn't be the last time he had to fight for what was right. The next battle, the next moment of injustice, was waiting just around the corner. But now, he dared to face it head-on, just as he had done before. Thank you for watching. If you believe in fairness and equality, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe for more. What would you have done in Jordan's shoes? Would you have stood up, or would you have stayed silent? Let us know in the comments below. Together, we can make a difference. Stay tuned for more stories that inspire change.